For today's lesson, our focus standard comes from Grade 8 on Functions, Standard A, Define, Evaluate, and Compare Functions. Our topic for this lesson is From Mathematical Models, Graphing. Our essential question is, what are the essential parts to a complete graph? Please take a moment, pausing the video if you need to write down your header. Be sure to include today's date, set up your question column and the note column, and resume the video when you're ready to begin. So this video is meant to be a little bit of a review, actually quite a bit of a review, on the parts of a graph, just as a refresher on when we are graphing, what are all the parts we need to make sure that we include. So I'm going to start here in the upper right hand corner. So we have a graph, and we always want to make sure that anytime we have a graph, even if it's a simple graph, that we put some kind of title on it. So here we have a graph that is unit test grade versus time spent studying. So right away the title should tell us what the graph is going to be about. Or in this case, it's identifying what data is being graphed. So we definitely need a title on our graphs. And then we always want to set up the axes. So the vertical axis is called the y-axis. And so, as I said, it's the vertical axis. It's also where we put the dependent variables. We're going to be talking a lot about independent versus dependent variables. So the vertical axis is our y-axis. You always need to make sure you put a y here. You also need the horizontal axis, which is our x, and we label it with an x to tell so. And our x-axis, as I mentioned, is the horizontal axis, but it's also where the independent variable goes. So I know you talk about this in science as well. And so there is where we need to label what data is being represented on each axis. So on our y-axis, we have a label that says unit test score, and we know that these numbers then are representing their test score as a percentage. So the label identifies the units represented on the axis. And I also have a label down here that on the x-axis, these numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are representing the number of hours studying. And so these numbers, both on the y-axis and on the x-axis, you may remember, are called the scale. And the scale is the size of the units on the axis. And it's important to note that the x-axis and the y-axis can differ. So the scale on the x-axis for hours studying is 0, right, over here. And then it's counting by ones. So it's 1 through 5. My scale on the y-axis is counting by 20s, so we have 0 here, and it's counting up by 20s for every grid line. It's important that you're consistent for the axis that you're on. So I can't skip numbers here. I'm counting by ones, so I need to make sure that every line represents one more. Whereas on the y-axis, I'm counting by 20, so every grid line is representing an increase of 20. And again, I wouldn't be able to skip. I need to make sure that I'm consistent. So we've talked about the y-axis, the x-axis, having a title on the graph. Here at 0, 0, so 0 on the y-axis is right here, and 0 on the x-axis is here. So this intersection point of the two axes is always 0, 0. And that has an official name called the origin. So the origin is 0, 0, the intersection of the two axes. And then the last thing, the whole point and reason of why we have graphs is we have data that we are plotting. And so here we have a line extending through, and we can see it goes through 1.5 and 40. So this is actually 1.5 hours of studying. This person earned a 40% on the test, versus this person who spent 3 hours studying earned an 80% on the test, so 380. So 380 and 1.5 40 are both examples of an ordered pair. And the ordered pair is important that tells us the location of a point. We always list the x value first and the y value second. And when we're listing an ordered pair, we use parentheses and a comma to separate the x and the y. You will often also hear of ordered pairs or points being referred to as a coordinate point, because it is the coordinates of the location on the graph. So those are the important parts of our graphs. We always need a title. We need to make sure the x and the y and the x-axis are always labeled, x and y. We need to label what the data represents on both the y-axis and the x-axis, keeping a consistent scale, although we can use one scale on the x-axis and a different scale on the y, and we plot our ordered pairs there. So that is when you're turning in a final draft of a graph and you're representing data, you need to make sure that you have all of these parts of a complete graph. And there's one more thing I want to talk about in this video, and that is identifying the 4 different parts to a full graph. So when we're looking at all 4 quadrants, so we were just looking at a graph that focused right up here in this part of the graph, but we know that graphs can extend and have 4 full parts. And though it's important to know a few things about them, that they are numbered. So this one that we were just in for the above example, this is called Quadrant 1, so I've used a Roman numeral 1 here. And this is just showing what the values are of the x-coordinate and the y part of the coordinate. So in this first quadrant, the x values here are always positive, and the y values are always positive. So anytime you're plotting any points in this area, you're going to have a positive x and a positive y. And then we actually number the quadrants going counterclockwise. So this is going to be the second quadrant to the left. And in the second quadrant, the x values are always negative. So it's going from here in the origin to the left. X values are always negative here, but we're still in the top half of the graph, so the y values are still positive. Down here in the bottom left corner is our quadrant 3. This is the location on a graph where both the x is negative and now the y is negative, because we've dropped down below the origin, so the y values are negative. So if you have a coordinate with a negative x and y, you know it's going to be in the third quadrant. And the final quadrant is the fourth quadrant. And again, we use Roman numerals to label them here, because we're to the right of the origin on the horizontal axis. Our x values are positive again, but we're still below the x-axis, so our y values are negative. So that's just a quick refresher on parts of a complete graph and making sure that you can identify the 4 quadrants of a graph. Please take a moment to make sure that your notes are complete. You could go ahead and start your summary, but make sure that you have all of this information copied down so that as we begin graphing more and more data, and we will do so throughout the whole school year, you know that what you need to include in your graphs.